The line of prisoners stretched across the dusty field, boots dragging through a wind that carried the smell of diesel and defeat. They had been soldiers once, men who shouted songs of the Reich, marched in straight lines, and believed in an empire without end. Now their rifles were gone. Their belts, watches, and last bits of pride had been stripped away. All that remained were their uniforms, their uncertainty, and the stories that lived in their heads. For years they had been told what awaited those who fell into Allied hands. The propaganda was relentless: brutal guards, starvation rations, backbreaking labor in mines, men beaten senseless for the smallest mistake. Surrender, the party warned, is worse than death. Many of the men in that line had grown up on these stories. They had whispered them to one another in foxholes under starlit skies, swearing they would never let themselves be captured alive. And yet, here they were, marched toward an American convoy under the watch of soldiers who didn't sneer, didn't scream, and didn't look like the monsters they'd been promised. An American guard strolled beside the line, a cigarette hanging loosely from his lips. When one prisoner stumbled, the guard didn't strike him. He steadied him with one hand and offered a drink from his canteen. A ripple of confusion ran through the captured column. Kindness was not in the script they had memorized. It had to be a trick. "Keep your strength up," the guard muttered in accented German. The words landed like stones dropped in still water, small, but unsettling. If the cruelty wasn't coming now, it would come later. That's what they told themselves. First the soft hand, then the iron fist. The trucks that carried them away from the battlefield were not cattle cars. They were crowded but clean. The men expected blows, mockery, perhaps starvation to begin at once. Instead, they were given bread, real white bread they hadn't tasted in years, and meat. Someone passed out small paper cups of coffee, its smell rich and alien to those who had learned to survive on bitterness and substitutes. Many held the food without touching it, suspecting poison. A few ate cautiously, chewing with the wary slowness of men expecting punishment to follow pleasure. Nothing happened. As the convoy rolled toward the port, conversations crackled in low, tight whispers. "They want us healthy," one man said. "For the mines," another replied. "For experiments," someone muttered. Laughter followed, not out of humor, but disbelief. It was easier to believe in monstrous intentions than in the possibility of mercy. The Atlantic crossing was its own kind of silence. On the upper decks, the prisoners huddled against the railings, staring at the endless gray water. None spoke much. In that wind and spray, the stories they'd been raised on collided with the reality of a journey that was, so far, neither brutal nor humiliating. They had been trained to march into Paris, London, Moscow. Not this. Not to cross an ocean as captives. Beneath the decks, they lay on bunks that weren't comfortable but weren't hellish either. The guards watched but didn't lash out. Meals were served on trays, not thrown like scraps. They were not treated as beasts, nor exactly as guests. Something in between. And that something was more unnerving than any cruelty could have been. At night, men whispered under the creak of the ship's hull. They whispered of families who would never believe this, of what it meant to be powerless and yet not tortured. They whispered of how long this would last. "They're fattening us," someone said. "You'll see," another voice answered. "Or maybe it's worse not to know." On the fifth day, a storm swept across the ocean, slamming waves against the ship like hammer blows. Lightning cut across the sky. Some prisoners prayed. Others cursed the sea. A few stared upward, their thoughts circling the same question over and over. What kind of enemy takes so much trouble to keep its captives alive? As the storm passed, so did some of their bravado. The endless horizon pressed down on them. For the first time, many began to sense how far they had fallen out of the war. Back home, they had been told America was a land of chaos and filth, of greedy merchants and weak men. But the ship itself, clean, efficient, steady, felt like a contradiction given form. It was the first crack in a wall of belief that had stood for years. Days bled together, marked only by roll calls, meals, and the soft thud of boots on steel decks. A few prisoners began to speak with guards in hesitant English or rusty schoolroom phrases. When an American handed out cigarettes, hands reached for them almost against their will. Smoke drifted across the deck, mingling with salt air and something harder to name: doubt. One night, as the lights dimmed and the engines hummed, a young private named Otto whispered to the man beside him, "Do you think they'll shoot us when we land?" The older man didn't answer. He just stared at the horizon that wasn't there. For all their whispered theories, none of them truly knew what waited at the other end of the ocean. By the seventh morning, the smell of land reached them before the sight of it. The ocean breeze carried traces of something sharp and new. Smoke, metal, the scent of industry. They crowded the railings like schoolboys, elbowing for a glimpse, and then it appeared through the mist. Cranes taller than any church steeple. Harbors buzzing with movement, ships stacked like toys, highways threading through endless cities. A murmur passed through the line of prisoners. America. To the men who had been told their enemies were decadent and collapsing, the sight was crushing. Here was a land untouched by war, bigger than they had imagined, stronger than they had feared. Its scale alone was a kind of weapon. They said nothing, but in their silence lay the first quiet fracture in the story they'd grown up believing. And as the ship moved steadily toward the docks, their hearts clenched, not in terror now, but in a strange, suffocating uncertainty. The ship slid toward the harbor with the slow confidence of a giant, its hull humming beneath the feet of the captured men. As the skyline of the American port unfurled before their eyes, the prisoners fell into an uneasy quiet. None of the stories they'd been told had prepared them for this. Steel cranes reached toward the clouds like titans. Endless lines of freight trains waited on parallel tracks, engines chuffing in rhythm. Smokestacks pumped white plumes into the morning air. There were trucks, convoys, bridges, warehouses, an entire industrial beast moving with mechanical precision. In Germany, they had been told America was decadent, soft, unprepared. But this didn't look soft. This looked powerful. A siren wailed somewhere across the docks as tugboats nudged the transport ship into place. On deck, the prisoners craned their necks, straining to take it all in. Some stared in silence. Others whispered under their breath as though speaking too loudly might make the scene vanish. "Mein Gott," one man muttered. It wasn't fear now. It was something colder, heavier. The realization that the enemy was far larger than they had ever imagined. The gangways rattled into place, and soldiers filed out under the watch of American guards. The guards didn't shove or shout. They simply moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before. A prisoner tripped on the ramp. An MP caught his arm, steadied him, and gestured him forward with a curt nod. It was nothing, and yet it wasn't nothing. It chipped away at everything these men had expected. The first breath of American air carried scents foreign and sharp. Coal smoke, roasted coffee, oil. It was a living, breathing machine of a country. As they were lined up on the dock, trucks rumbled past, laden with goods and soldiers. Nearby, civilians moved through their day, barely glancing at the enemy arrivals. To the prisoners' astonishment, no crowds jeered. No mob spat or threw stones. They were expecting hatred. What they found was indifference. A child sitting on her father's shoulders waved at the convoy as it passed. A teenage boy on a bicycle tried to follow the column for a few blocks before peeling away. Somewhere a radio played swing music, bright and playful, drifting through the air like something from another universe. The prisoners didn't know whether to laugh or flinch. Then came the buses, clean, orderly, waiting in rows like an unspoken promise. The Germans had expected cattle cars, iron bars, filth. Instead, they stepped into vehicles with padded seats and curtained windows. Guards sat near the doors, rifles slung low, but there was no menace in their faces. Only procedure. The convoy rolled out of the harbor, and the city spread around them like a vision from a world they'd been told didn't exist. Broad avenues cut through neighborhoods of tidy houses with white fences. Shops displayed fruit and meat in their windows as if war belonged to someone else's continent. Gas stations blinked with bright neon signs. Billboards towered over highways, promising cars, soap, radios, and cigarettes. In the back seats, the prisoners murmured to one another. "Look at all this," someone whispered. "Everything is new," said another. "It's all still standing," a third replied, his voice low. For men who came from bombed-out cities, cracked roads, and hunger lines, this abundance was almost obscene. It wasn't just that America was strong. It was untouched. The farther inland the convoy traveled, the wider the land became. Fields stretched into the horizon, vast and golden. Wooden barns and windmills dotted the landscape like toys scattered on a green floor. Trains slid past at impossible speeds. The prisoners had grown used to cramped Europe, to broken bridges and collapsing towns. Here the road seemed endless. It was as if the country itself was taunting them with its scale. Some of the men leaned their foreheads against the glass, their breath fogging up the windows. They didn't speak. They simply stared, and in that staring something inside them shifted. A quiet, reluctant acknowledgement of a world that was bigger than the one they'd been promised. They passed through towns where shopkeepers stacked goods outside their doors and children rode bicycles without looking twice at the guarded buses. Housewives hung laundry in backyards. Teenagers loitered near diners. The war seemed far away, an ocean away, even though it had delivered these prisoners to this very place. One of the younger soldiers whispered to himself, "This isn't how enemies live." He didn't mean to say it aloud, but heads turned, and several men nodded before looking away, as if ashamed of the thought. Hours later, as the sun dipped low, the convoy turned off the highway. The hum of engines echoed against open fields. Ahead, the prisoners saw their destination for the first time. Rows of barracks laid out in precise geometry, surrounded by fences and watchtowers. But even here, something was wrong with the picture they'd imagined. The fences were there, yes, but so were lawns, gravel paths, a flagpole, a well-lit gate. The buildings were orderly, not crumbling. The watchtowers held guards, but they didn't shout. Everything was still, efficient and almost sterile in its calm. The buses halted. Doors opened with soft pneumatic sighs. One by one, the prisoners stepped out into the fading light. The ground beneath their boots was firm, dry, and quiet. An American officer with a clipboard shouted orders, not in rage, but with clarity. Groups were formed, names were checked, belongings catalogued. The guards moved with practiced detachment, not hatred. Even that detached efficiency was unsettling. The prisoners had prepared their minds for cruelty. What they found was structure. A Red Cross vehicle rolled past. Its logo shone bright in the dusk. A truck followed, unloading boxes of supplies. The prisoners exchanged wary glances. They had expected filth and punishment, not logistics and organization. From beyond the fence, the sound of crickets rose with the evening. Somewhere inside the camp, lights flickered on, one barrack at a time. A wave of realization passed through the new arrivals. They were here for the long haul, not to be executed, not to be starved, but to be contained. As they were marched toward the processing area, a sergeant passed out slips of paper with numbers. An officer explained through a translator that they would be registered, assigned bunks, and given uniforms. The words felt surreal. They were supposed to be broken. Instead, they were being managed. That night, many lay awake on their assigned bunks staring at the ceiling. The smells of soap, disinfectant, and distant food replaced the scent of battlefield mud. Through the open windows, they could hear the faint hum of generators, the rustle of wind through trees, and somewhere, the low laugh of an American guard on night duty. They were enemies, yes, but in this place, that enmity had been wrapped in an unnervingly civilized package. And in that quiet, more than a few of them wondered, what kind of country treats its enemies like this? The gates clanged shut behind them with the metallic finality of captivity. But what lay inside was not the brutal cage they had braced for. Instead of mud and filth, the ground beneath their boots was clean gravel. Instead of snarling dogs, there were neat rows of wooden barracks, each with a small number painted over the door. Warm electric light glowed softly from the windows. An American sergeant barked orders in practiced rhythm, sorting prisoners into groups for registration. It was efficient, almost mechanical, like they were being admitted to some vast impersonal institution, rather than thrown into a pit of suffering. At each checkpoint, names were recorded, numbers assigned, meager belongings catalogued. Guards watched, but their rifles were slung casually. They moved like men who didn't need to prove control. They already had it. Inside the processing hall, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something unfamiliar. Soap. Prisoners were given uniforms, loose khaki clothing marked with PW. No stripes, no branding of shame, just clothing. Then came the showers. Real hot water. Steam rolled over their faces. After years of mud, rationed soap, and icy makeshift washings, the sensation was almost shocking. "Are we really prisoners?" one man whispered to another. "If this is a prison," the other replied dryly, "then we've misunderstood everything." Outside, the barracks were arranged with the geometry of military precision. Each building housed rows of bunks lined against whitewashed walls. Wooden stoves burned softly at either end, radiating a comfortable heat. Mattresses, while thin, were real. Blankets were clean. A few men ran their hands along the fabric, half expecting to find hidden nails. There were none. The mess hall sat at the center of the compound, a low, wide structure with windows that let in the fading light. The first dinner was served without ceremony. Long tables, steel trays, and lines that moved quickly. The prisoners had been bracing themselves for watery soup and stale bread. Instead, they stared down at plates heavy with meatloaf, potatoes, beans, coffee, even milk. The silence that followed was louder than any gunfire. Some men didn't touch the food at first. Suspicion was too deeply wired to be dismissed in a single evening. They sniffed at it, nudged it with their forks, Others took the first cautious bites, chewing slowly, waiting, but nothing came. No beating, no shouting, just the ordinary clatter of trays and the low hum of a kitchen at work. One by one, they ate. Whispers flickered through the hall like sparks. They feed us like soldiers, better than at the front. Why would they waste this on us? A guard refilled the coffee urn. No one shoved them to hurry. It was unnerving. After the meal, they were shown the washrooms, the laundry sheds, and a recreation area they didn't quite believe was real. A small field stretched beyond the barracks, already marked with faint soccer lines. Near the fence, a few benches sat under newly painted lampposts. It was, unmistakably, designed to function, not to break men down, but to contain them. That night, the barracks filled with restless breathing. Some lay on their backs, staring at the ceiling beams. Others whispered in small clusters. "This can't last," someone muttered. "They want something from us," another answered. "Of course they do. Nobody treats enemies like this for free." But the facts were harder to argue with than the whispers. They weren't beaten. They weren't starved. And for the first time since surrender, they weren't afraid of what tomorrow's sunrise might bring. Over the following days, routines emerged like quiet tides. Roll call at dawn. Breakfast, again shockingly abundant. Tasks during the day, mostly maintenance or waiting for assignments. Medical checks. Letters issued by the Red Cross for writing home. The camps ran on schedule, not cruelty. The medical station surprised them most. Rows of clean cots, nurses, actual doctors. Men who had limped through mud-soaked campaigns were treated for wounds and infections as if their lives had value. An officer with a broken wrist from capture found himself in a cast by noon. A young conscript with trench rot was given ointment and bandages. The idea that enemies would heal them rather than let them rot was a blow to everything they'd been told. Censorship hung over their letters, but just the fact that they could write at all felt miraculous. Alive, safe, fed. Some scribbled those words like lifelines. Others left them out, fearing disbelief. How could their families imagine America like this? There were fences, of course. Barbed wire traced the perimeter like a reminder carved in steel. Watchtowers cast long shadows over the yard, but the guards didn't pace like wolves. They stood, they watched, they smoked, sometimes even joked with each other. The air carried no whip-crack of boots or shouted insults. Discipline existed, but it wasn't cruel. It was structured, almost polite. The physical environment itself felt designed to unsettle their assumptions. They had expected to be treated as animals. Instead, they were treated as men. Through the fence, they could see the outside world. Farmlands stretching to the horizon, barns, windmills, dirt roads winding through fields. Sometimes they glimpsed farmers at work. Sometimes they saw children on bicycles, riding parallel to the fence line, waving as if to neighbors rather than enemies. That sight, more than anything else, disoriented them. To these civilians, German soldiers weren't monsters. They were background noise. At night, the unease ripened into something quieter. Doubt. One man stared through the narrow gap in the barrack wall and said, "They don't hate us." Another answered, "They should." As weeks passed, they realized how little their captors resembled the nightmare figures built in their minds. No one forced them to kneel. No one spat at their faces. The guards didn't seem to burn with hatred. In fact, they often looked bored. That boredom was its own kind of power. It meant America had so many resources, so much security, that even its enemies were handled as an afterthought. The war was raging elsewhere. Here, behind the wire, the prisoners were living in a strange limbo. A world of structure, comfort, and captivity. The psychological dissonance deepened each night. They still whispered of suspicion. They still feared some hidden cruelty, but the whispers grew weaker. Because the walls of their expectations weren't being hammered down. They were being eroded, one quiet kindness at a time. On a particularly cold night, after lights out, the barracks settled into the slow rhythm of sleep. But a few men remained awake, staring at the wooden ceiling. Outside, a guard's boots crunched against gravel in a slow, lazy patrol. Somewhere far off, a radio played faint swing music. "This isn't war," someone whispered. "It is," came the reply. "Just not the kind we were promised." And in that silence, the seeds of doubt burrowed a little deeper. Morning in the camp came with a whistle, not a scream. The sound cut through the fog like a train pulling into a quiet station. Sharp, but never cruel. The prisoners rose from their bunks, many still expecting the rough hands and kicks they'd once imagined. But instead of brutality, they found routine. Clean clothes, hot breakfast, a day that unfolded the same way, with almost unnerving precision. The mess hall smelled of coffee and butter. Real butter, Men carried trays along polished counters, as if they'd stepped into some parallel world. An ordered world where enemies were not starved, but fed. Eggs, toast, fruit, coffee, sometimes oatmeal. For soldiers who had scraped by on thin rations, it felt almost obscene. The first weeks, they ate in silence, shoveling food in with the guilty speed of men who believed it could be taken away at any moment. But the food didn't stop coming, and slowly, their eating slowed too. After breakfast, work assignments were posted on a chalkboard by the gate. Teams were sent to nearby farms, lumber camps, or factory warehouses. Under guard, yes, but lightly, almost casually. Trucks carried them through open countryside, past yellow fields and red barns, into towns where people went about their business with barely a glance at the POWs in the back of the flatbeds. The guards chatted about baseball scores and weekend dances, as if war were something happening on another planet. One prisoner, Muller, whispered to the man beside him, "They don't even look at us like enemies." "Maybe they've already won," came the reply. The farms were the strangest part. The farmers nodded at them, gave instructions through interpreters, and then simply watched them work. They weren't chained. They weren't beaten. They picked apples, stacked hay, shoveled dirt. Some farmers even brought them lemonade on hot days. For men raised on stories of barbaric enemies, it was almost unbearable to reconcile kindness with the image they had of Americans. One afternoon, an elderly farmer handed a cup of water directly to a young prisoner. The boy froze, uncertain whether to take it. The farmer waited. No tricks, just a cup of water. That small gesture burned itself into memory. Back in the camp, the rhythm of daily life blurred into something strange, something dangerously close to ordinary. Laundry days, scheduled haircuts, soccer matches on the dusty field. They even formed teams, argued over rules, and cheered goals with real joy. Guards leaned against the fences, watching with amused detachment. Some nights, the floodlights cast long rectangles of light across the yard as two teams of Germans ran breathless in their makeshift uniforms, their laughter echoing beneath the watchtowers. No one had imagined that war could feel like this. Books appeared next. Stacks of them, English, German, sometimes French, distributed by the Red Cross and church groups. At first, the men eyed them suspiciously, expecting hidden messages, propaganda, traps. But boredom is a patient persuader. Slowly, hands reached for pages. Dictionaries were passed around, and halting words were sounded out in low voices at night. A few men who had studied English before the war began quietly teaching the others. It was not loyalty, it was curiosity. And curiosity is a quiet, dangerous thing. The camp also offered classes: carpentry, accounting, even basic engineering. It was a calculated generosity, one the prisoners recognized but couldn't quite resist. To be given the choice to learn, to build something instead of being broken, chipped away at the walls in their minds. A young man named Heinz enrolled in an English class, insisting to his friends it was only to know the enemy's language. But by the third week, he was humming the alphabet song under his breath. And then there were letters. Actual letters. Paper and envelopes handed out every Sunday morning, a privilege that made some men tremble more than battle had. They wrote to mothers, wives, sisters. "I'm alive," many began. "I am fed. I am treated well." The words felt foreign in their hands. Some hesitated to write the truth, fearing no one back home would believe them. Censorship was strict, but the very act of writing home, of describing the strange captivity, made the world outside feel less distant. When replies came, months later, men gathered around like schoolboys at a gate, their hearts pounding at every name called. One evening, as the sun slipped down behind the tree line, a guard brought out a portable radio. It was a small, dented box, its dial glowing faint orange. From it came the soft swing of a Glenn Miller tune, jaunty and impossibly alive. The prisoners froze, some with cups of coffee in their hands. It wasn't a song of war. It was a song of life, of a country dancing while others bled. Someone laughed quietly, then caught himself. "Careful," whispered another. "You'll forget you're a prisoner." But the music threaded its way through the fence, through the cold, through the thin layers of ideology. Some of the younger men tapped their boots in time with the rhythm. One whistled a shaky note. The guards didn't stop them. They didn't care. And that indifference, so casual, so sure, was as destabilizing as kindness. Weeks blurred into months. Suspicion never fully died, but it began to live alongside something more dangerous: familiarity. They recognized guards by name now. They joked in broken English. Some learned how to play baseball. A few who worked at farms brought back apples and jokes about stubborn cows. The camp became a rhythm. Inside the barracks, the tone of night whispers had changed. no longer frantic, no longer soaked in fear. Now the talk was curious, even reflective. "They treat us like people," someone said one night. "Rolling a cigarette. They shouldn't," came the answer, but without conviction. The ideological wall that had once defined us and them was no longer smooth. It was cracking, not from pressure, but from warmth, from repetition, from too many moments that didn't fit the story they'd grown up believing. Each soccer match, each letter, each English word learned was another fracture. And yet the fence still stood. Every man knew it. Freedom was always just out of reach. That constant presence, the sharp glint of barbed wire under moonlight, kept them anchored in reality. They were prisoners, not guests, but they were prisoners living lives that felt eerily close to normal. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled over the camp, a group of men huddled near the stove, warming their hands. One of them, a quiet carpenter named Ernst, began softly humming a tune he'd heard on the radio. At first, the others mocked him. Then, one by one, they joined in, not with words, but with the rhythm. The storm outside howled. Inside, for a brief moment, the war seemed impossibly far away. The announcement came on a pale Friday afternoon, folded into the daily bulletin like an afterthought. "Tonight, film screening in the recreation hall. Attendance voluntary." No one believed it at first. A movie? For prisoners? It sounded like a joke, or worse, a trick. But by sunset, as lamps buzzed to life along the camp's perimeter, curiosity began to outweigh suspicion. Groups of men gathered outside the recreation building, some scoffing, some pretending not to care, most trying not to show how intrigued they really were. The hall smelled faintly of wood polish and sawdust. Folding chairs had been set up in long, uneven rows. At the front stood a small projector, metal, boxy, humming faintly. An American private fiddled with the reels while two guards leaned against the back wall, hands in their pockets, as if this were the dullest assignment of their week. The prisoners filed in slowly, sitting stiff-backed, unsure of what rules applied here. No one spoke above a whisper. "What kind of film would they show us?" someone asked. "Propaganda," another replied, almost certain. "Or maybe one of their war victories." The lights clicked off. The projector rattled to life. A thin white beam sliced through the dark, catching the floating dust in the air. Then, an image bloomed onto the wall. It wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a political speech. It was a woman. A woman in a flowing dress, walking down a sunlit street lined with trees. The silence in the room shifted. The prisoners leaned forward, not quite believing their eyes. For men who had marched through rubble, through cities blackened by bombs, the simple sight of a peaceful street was almost violent in its beauty. The film was a musical comedy. Bright, warm, careless. Two men in suits danced down a sidewalk. A brass band swelled in the background. People laughed on screen. Laughed. A few prisoners actually flinched at the sound, as if joy itself was foreign. The first few minutes passed in stunned silence. Then a quiet cough. Then, almost timidly, a ripple of laughter when a man on screen tripped over a flower cart. It was small, cautious laughter. But it was real. For the prisoners, cinema had always been a weapon of the state. Nazi newsreels were cold and sharp, made to instruct, to glorify, to shape. The people on those screens never truly lived. They marched. They saluted. They killed or were killed. But here was a different kind of world. A world where people danced in the rain and flirted on street corners. A world that, according to everything they'd been told, wasn't supposed to exist. The film unfolded scene after scene of an America they had never imagined. Colorful storefronts, bright clothes, happy faces. No rubble, no hunger, no fear. Inside the dark hall, dozens of prisoners sat frozen in the flickering light, their shadows stretched long against the walls. For the first time since capture, they weren't soldiers, or prisoners, or enemies. They were just men watching a story. Halfway through the film, an American soldier cracked open the door to let in some fresh air. Swing music from the projector's speaker mingled with the chirp of crickets outside. In that moment, the war felt impossibly far away. When the romantic lead leaned in to kiss the woman, a wave of discomfort rolled through the room. Some men averted their eyes. Some smirked. Others stared openly, unable to look away. They had been taught that American society was decadent, broken, filthy. Yet what they saw was elegance, playfulness, warmth. "Lies," someone whispered under his breath, but his voice trembled. When the movie ended, the projector sputtered to a stop, and the light snapped back on. For a moment, no one moved. The spell hung in the air like fog. Then, slowly, chairs scraped back. The prisoners filed out into the cool night, walking slower than usual. each man carrying something wordless in his chest. Outside, the camp was unchanged: barbed wire, floodlights, guards. But something inside the prisoners had shifted. A guard joked to another. "Didn't think they'd laugh that much. They're still human," the other replied with a shrug. Over the next days, the movie became the quiet center of conversation. In the barracks, in the mess hall, even at work sites, whispers traveled. "Did you see the car she drove? The shape of it? That store with all the clothes, was that real?" They kissed in public. No one cared. And the streets? No rubble. Each man interpreted what he'd seen differently. Some insisted it was staged, pure propaganda. Others pointed out how effortless it all looked, too effortless to fake. A few said nothing at all. But their silence was louder than words. The next Friday, another film was announced. And though many pretended to be indifferent, the line at the recreation hall formed earlier this time. A comedy, then a western, then a love story. The projector became a regular pulse in camp life. In one film, cowboys galloped across open plains. The prisoners, many of whom had grown up in crowded cities, stared at the screen as if they were seeing the edge of the world. In another, a jazz band filled a nightclub with brassy sound. Men tapped their boots without realizing. Some even clapped softly at the end of a song. No guard told them to stop. Cinema worked its quiet alchemy night after night. It wasn't forced. It didn't preach. It simply showed them a world that was warm, loud, alive. A world that stood in direct contradiction to the one their leaders had described. One night, after a romantic comedy, a guard lingered at the door while the prisoners filed out. He watched them, amused. "Never thought a bunch of Nazis would like Fred Astaire," he muttered. The prisoners didn't know who Fred Astaire was, but they knew his dance steps now, burned into their memory like something from a dream. Back in the barracks, men replayed scenes in their heads. The way the music swelled. The way people smiled without fear. The light in the streets. Some whispered about it. Others hummed the songs. A few lay silently, their hands behind their heads, staring at the ceiling, asking questions they'd never dared to ask. Why would a collapsing, degenerate society make a world like that? Why did it feel so alive? Cinema had done what no interrogation could. It had seduced them, not through ideology, but through beauty, rhythm, and the soft promise of something they didn't have. Weeks turned into months, and the screenings became ritual. Men who once laughed bitterly now saved their best shirts for movie night. They arrived early. They picked the same seats. They began to recognize actors, to follow faces across different films. A guard joked, "You're becoming real Americans." No one laughed at that, but no one denied it either. For some, the films were an escape, a couple of hours where they could forget the war, the wire, the number stamped on their clothing. For others, they were a slow, unnerving education in what their country had lied about. Every smile on that screen was a crack in the fortress of belief. One evening, after a screening of a musical filled with trumpets and dancers in shimmering gowns, a young prisoner named Otto lay in his bunk, wide awake. The moonlight through the window cast a faint silver line across his face. He whispered to no one in particular. "I didn't think a place like that could exist." Across the room, someone answered softly, "Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just a film." But no one fully believed that anymore. Because what mattered wasn't whether the movies were real. What mattered was that they were possible. And that possibility was something no barbed wire could keep out. By the time the third month of screenings arrived, the projector had become as much a part of camp life as morning roll call. Every announcement was met with the same ritual. A quiet shuffle through the gravel paths, men pretending to be indifferent while checking their watches, followed by the unmistakable press of bodies near the recreation hall doors. No one admitted it out loud, but movie night had become the heartbeat of the camp. The films were never introduced. No speeches, no forced interpretations. The lights simply dimmed, the reel began to spin, and the world outside the wire dissolved. One evening, it was a slapstick comedy with pratfalls and banana peels. The next, a western where sunlight spilled endlessly over open plains. Sometimes it was a romance that made the barracks feel smaller afterward, as if the air itself held its breath. Each screening was a quiet assault, not with weapons, but with contradictions. For years, the men had been told America was a land of decay, a society poisoned by greed and corruption, too weak to endure. But what they saw on the screen told a different story. Laughter, abundance, confidence. Not the shrill laughter of propaganda cartoons, but something unguarded, human. Streets without rubble, children playing, women speaking with a freedom that, in Germany, would have been branded indecent. It was not a lecture. It was not a command. And perhaps that made it more dangerous than any speech. In the barracks, discussions grew sharper. "It's all fake," one man insisted, pacing near the stove. "They're showing us fantasies to break our will." "Then why does it feel real?" Another shot back. "If it's fake, it's a better lie than ours ever was." No one had an answer. For some, the films were an unbearable temptation. They laughed despite themselves, memorized lines, began to hum melodies in the yard. For others, the slow erosion of certainty was terrifying. A corporal who'd once recited party slogans by heart began skipping screenings altogether. He sat on his bunk when the others left, trying to drown out the distant music with forced silence. But silence, in a camp so filled with echoes, was brittle. Not everyone could look away. One night, a western played to a packed hall. Dusty landscapes, wide skies, and a lone cowboy standing against injustice. A prisoner named Weber leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face caught in the flicker of the reel. He didn't speak English, but he understood everything: the moral clarity, the courage, the way the story gave weight to individuals. Not just the state. "Back in the barracks," he whispered, "they tell stories about one man standing against power." "And in Germany?" someone asked. "In Germany," Weber said slowly, "there is only one man." The line spread like smoke, repeated in mess halls and latrine corners, sometimes with laughter, sometimes without. It was a joke. It was also not a joke. The guards noticed the change, too. The prisoners no longer sat stiffly in the theater. They leaned back, they relaxed, they laughed. They cheered at underdogs and booed villains. They clapped during songs. The screenings had ceased to be a curiosity. They were now a shared language. Prisoners began referring to films by their actors, giving names German inflections: Der Fred Astaire, Die Ginger Rogers. Men who once quoted Hitler now mimicked Chaplin. The Reich's iron script was being rewritten with tap shoes and jokes. A particularly heated argument erupted one afternoon near the laundry shed. A group of men debated whether what they saw on screen represented real America or carefully chosen illusions. "It's theater," one insisted. "Look at how happy they are." "Nobody is that happy. Then why do they let us watch?" Another challenged. "If it's a trick, why not force it on us? Why let us choose?" That question hung in the air, unanswered. Choice itself was something they hadn't known for years. Even the most disciplined among them felt the cracks. Sergeant Capel, a hardened veteran, once barked at a group of younger prisoners for humming a swing tune. "Have you forgotten where you are?" he shouted. But later that night, a guard caught him lingering at the back of the theater, arms folded tight, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen. Letters home began to change too. Subtle at first, words like safe and fed were joined by strange and different. A few even tried to describe the films, carefully, since the censors watched closely. "They show us things," one letter read, "that make me wonder if everything we learned was wrong." For families still trapped under the weight of a collapsing Reich, those words were incomprehensible. How could prisoners of war speak of music and laughter while cities burned? The films also did something more subtle. They created new dreams. Men who had been raised on collective ideology began to imagine personal futures. Not glorious Reich victories, not banners and parades, but small things. Open streets, music in the night, a cafe, a dance. A few even admitted to themselves quietly that they dreaded the day they'd be sent home. The most dangerous conversations were the quiet ones at night. "Do you ever wonder?" whispered Otto from the top bunk. "If we were wrong?" Another voice answered from below. "You think too much." But silence followed, thick and restless, because everyone, in their own way, was thinking too much. A romance film cracked something open in particular. The woman on screen, strong, witty, radiant, defied everything they'd been told about the moral decay of the enemy. She wasn't weak or cheap. She was alive. And when the hero deferred to her, rather than controlling her, a ripple of unease moved through the room. It was a cultural punch, quiet, elegant, and devastating. In Germany, power spoke down. On screen, it often spoke across. The screenings began to shape identity. The young soldiers, especially those who had grown up entirely under Nazi rule, absorbed the films like sponges. They started using English phrases they picked up. Some learned actors' names by heart. A few even styled their hair like the Americans they saw. A subtle rebellion behind wire. A guard once asked jokingly, "You boys want to be cowboys now?" No one answered, but more than one of them had already imagined it. Not everyone embraced this quiet transformation. A faction formed among the older, more ideologically hardened prisoners. They denounced the films, accused others of weakness. "You're letting them poison you," one man hissed at a friend. but even their voices grew less certain with each passing week. Because ridicule could not compete with the ease of laughter, the Americans never lectured, they never explained the films, and perhaps that was their sharpest weapon. The men were left alone with their interpretations. And in that space, unguarded, unstructured, old convictions withered. What struck them most wasn't the extravagance. It was the ordinariness. Grocery stores with shelves full of food, cars that ran, streets that shone at night, couples who argued, danced, kissed, people free to mock their leaders, to laugh at power. It was messy, inconsistent, even chaotic, but it was alive. And in the quiet minds of men who'd been raised on rigid certainties, that aliveness was corrosive. By early spring, the ideological divide inside the camp was open. Some clung harder to the Reich than ever, retreating behind slogans like a shield. Others drifted further away from that world with each film reel. But even those who still believed found themselves changed. It was no longer possible to see America as a faceless enemy. It had a shape now, a rhythm, a smile. A small, telling moment came one night when the projector jammed mid-film. The image froze, burned slightly, then went dark. A groan rose from the prisoners, not out of boredom, but genuine disappointment. Men who once swore they'd never let enemy filth touch their minds, now sat waiting, impatient, for the magic to resume. And when it did, they cheered. The films didn't make them Americans, but they made them doubt, and doubt, once planted, grows in silence. On a humid evening, Otto lay in his bunk again, staring at the ceiling. Someone in the far corner softly whistled a jazz tune. Another muttered the name of an actor. The glow of the projector still clung to their minds like an afterimage, long after the lights had come back on. Otto whispered, "What if what we were told was never true?" No one answered, but no one called him a fool anymore either. The day the repatriation orders came, the camp felt different. It wasn't celebration that filled the air, nor sorrow, but a strange, quiet tension. Men had spent months counting days, yet when the final one arrived, it felt unreal. Like the end of a dream no one had admitted they were living. The barracks were filled with the scraping of trunks, the folding of uniforms, the soft rustle of letters carefully tucked into pockets. The guards moved with a kind of polite distance, neither triumphant nor cruel. This was routine now. Prisoners leaving in groups, heading to ships that would carry them back across the Atlantic. And yet, beneath the surface, something unspoken lingered. These men had arrived in chains of fear and propaganda. Now they were leaving with full bellies, clothes on their backs, and the strange aftertaste of a life that hadn't been what they expected. That night, before departure, they held one final screening. The announcement was brief, almost casual. Last film tonight, all welcome. But everyone came. The recreation hall overflowed. Men stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. A few guards slipped in as well, pretending to be bored. The projector whirred one last time, filling the room with the familiar white beam. Dust danced in its light like snow. The film was another musical, light and golden, brimming with songs and crowded streets, and people who seemed untouched by the war. Laughter rose in waves, hesitant at first, then freer, like the last breath before diving into something cold. Some men clapped without realizing it. Others simply sat still, eyes fixed on the glowing wall as if trying to burn the moment into memory. A young prisoner whispered, "I'll never see this again," another answered softly, "You might." But they both knew how unlikely that was. When the credits rolled, no one stood up immediately. The room remained in half-darkness, full of men who suddenly understood that this ritual, this impossible, fragile world behind wire, was ending. The guards turned the lights on. Conversations broke like ice. In the weeks that followed, transports began. The same ships that had carried them to America now waited to take them back to a Germany that no longer resembled the one they'd left behind. Men crowded the decks, wrapped in coats against the Atlantic wind. Some talked quietly, some stared at the horizon. Miller stood near the railing, looking out at the black water. "They'll never believe us," he muttered. Weber, beside him, gave a hollow laugh. "Of course they won't. Who would believe we watched comedies while everything burned?" The memory of those nights, the music, the laughter, the beam of light, was already beginning to feel fragile, like something that could vanish if spoken too loudly. When the ships docked in Europe, the contrast was brutal. Bombed harbors, rubble, cities split open like wounds. The air smelled of coal dust and loss. Men who had once been soldiers of a powerful Reich stepped onto shattered soil as prisoners no longer, but not quite citizens either. They carried duffel bags, letters, and something less tangible. A story that didn't fit. Families met them with disbelief. Mothers embraced sons with tears. Wives held husbands. But when talk turned to America, the faces grew wary. "They fed you?" someone asked. "Yes," came the answer. "They let you watch movies?" The silence that followed was always the same. Not anger, not envy, just a disbelieving void. How could anyone understand that captivity had not been cruelty, but confusion wrapped in kindness? How could they speak of film nights when neighbors were digging out the ruins of their homes? Some prisoners stopped mentioning it altogether. They folded those memories away like fragile photographs, tucked deep where no one could mock or question them. Others, especially the younger men, couldn't keep silent. Their stories spilled out in whispers at bars, in workshops, in broken conversations over bread rations. "They showed us everything," one said. Their cities, their songs, their women laughing. It was different. It was the only word that truly fit. For a long time, those memories lived as private contradictions. To speak of them openly was to risk being called soft, or worse, a traitor. Yet in the years that followed, the stories grew. Not as official history, but as something passed down in kitchens, in factory lines, in living rooms. "Do you know what the Americans did?" someone would say. "They let us watch their films. What lingered wasn't just the images, but what they meant." Those films had shown a country so confident it didn't need to crush its enemies to change them. It only needed to be what it was. Some men tried to return to their old convictions, to rebuild the mental walls that cinema had cracked. But the memory always leaked through. It crept into the corners of their minds during sleepless nights, humming with jazz, flickering with light. Weber, once an officer, found himself replaying a single scene over and over. A woman stepping out of a car, laughing in the sunlight. He didn't know her name, didn't remember the film, but the moment felt more real than half the speeches he'd saluted through. For Otto, the youngest among them, the films became something else entirely. A door. He learned English after the war, drawn by the rhythm of the language he'd once picked up in the camp. Years later, he would tell his children that the first time he ever imagined a future beyond rubble was not in a classroom or a church, but in the dark, watching a cowboy ride across a desert he'd never seen. Not all men changed. Some buried the experience. Some rejected it outright. But even for them, something remained. A small, irretrievable sliver of a different world. A seed planted quietly in the dark. Historians who interviewed former prisoners decades later were often startled at how often cinema came up. Not the food, not the barracks, not the guards, but the films. Men who could barely recall the names of their commanders remembered Charlie Chaplin, Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers. They could hum the songs. They could describe the way the projector light looked cutting through the darkness. It wasn't just movies, Weber told an interviewer late in life. It was proof that what we'd been told was not the only truth. The irony was sharp. The Americans had never set out to re-educate them with speeches. They hadn't needed to. A reel of film, a few songs, some laughter. It did the work silently. In the post-war years, as West Germany rebuilt itself, American culture seeped in through Marshall Plan shipments, radio broadcasts, magazines. But for thousands of former POWs, that culture was already familiar. They had encountered it not as conquerors, nor even as free men, but as captives behind wire. And strangely, that had made it more powerful. In smoky bars, men once trained to obey the Führer now tapped their boots to swing tunes. They remembered the sound of applause in a POW camp thousands of miles away. It wasn't a story of heroism. It was something quieter. A shift. One autumn afternoon decades later, Otto visited a cinema in Frankfurt with his granddaughter. A black and white film was playing, a restored American musical from the 1940s. As the lights dimmed and the familiar crackle of the reel began, he closed his eyes. For a second, he wasn't in Frankfurt anymore. He was 19, sitting in a makeshift theater behind barbed wire, surrounded by men who no longer quite believed everything they'd been told. The screen lit up. A woman laughed, and Otto smiled too. The wire was long gone. But the memory had never faded.